Thank you for that introduction, and welcome everyone. Thanks for making it here after lunch. My talk is a decade in lessons in open source licensing, and in particular, reviewing more than 1,000 releases, what I've learnt over that time. And you may think that 1,000 releases is a bit of an exaggeration. You know, people tend to make big claims like that. So I actually looked up on the mailing list the other day, the ASF, which I'm a member of. I'm sure I should do that. And all our email is archived, and I have voted on 1,647 threads. So it's actually more than 1,000. Not all of those are releases, but most of them are. So it's definitely more than 1,000 releases. So I've been involved with the ASF for more than a decade, coming up to 15 years now. I'm a current board member, and I also help out at the Apache Incubator. So that's where new projects come and learn how to become Apache projects. And I'm also I'm working for a company called Data Strata, and I'm a community manager there, and I helped a ASF project go all the way from incubation to becoming a top-level project, which is called Apache Gravitino. So you should check that out. But that's not what I'm talking about today. So yes, 1,000 releases. For a while there, people were jokingly calling me Mr. -1 because I would come along and always find an error in their release. You know, something usually to do with licensing, but there are other things that can go wrong as well. And the ASF treats licensing very seriously. In fact, it's one of the things that we actually have a release process where the people who are creating releases will actually vote on the releases. And part of that vote is there's a checklist of a whole lot of things that you need to check, and licensing is one of them. And I think that's why the ASF as a foundation has become as important as it is, because people trust our software, and they know that they can use our software with very minimal legal risk, that they know that everything's being checked. So some of the things I'm going to go through in this talk is what the ASF does, but that can be applied outside of the Apache Software Foundation. It can be applied to a small team, or it can be applied to your own project, whether it's up on GitHub or wherever. So why licensing matters is that you want to be able to use the software without legal risk. You want to protect the contributors who donate code to your software. You don't want them getting into legal trouble. That would be unpleasant. And if you do something wrong, it's probably going to damage your reputation. And it may be that you lose trust either from your community or from people who use your software. And neither of those are good things. It may just be a simple matter that you have to comply with policy. So, you know, if you work for a large corporate company, they're obviously going to have policies on open source software, and, you know, they would include licensing policies, and you'll need to comply with those. So what I'm going to talk about is more of the practical side of things, not theoretical risks and so forth. And most of that is from, as I said, me reviewing more than 1,000 releases. And so I've run into quite a few issues along the way. So I'm going to give you some practical tips on what you can do. And I'm also talk a little bit about where the industry has gone and what it might look like a little bit into the future. So there's often misconceptions around open source licensing, particularly among developers. And that's fair enough, because, you know, their day-to-day job is writing code. They don't really care about this legal stuff, right? You know, they know it's important, but they may not understand it. That's often, you know, legal documents and licenses is sometimes complicated. But I'm just going to go through a couple of ones here. So the first one is that all open source licenses are compatible with each other. And the fact is they're not. There's several broad categories of licenses. You can think of them as a group of licenses which are called the permissive licenses, and they're licenses like the Apache license and MIT and BSD licenses and things along those lines. And they're all broadly compatible with each other. There's another group of licenses which are the copyleft licenses. The best example would be the GPL license. And they're not necessarily compatible with the permissive licenses, but it depends on your risk appetite, really, is what it comes down to. So at the Apache Software Foundation, we take a very conservative view, and so the GPL license isn't compatible with the Apache license. However, the reverse isn't true. You can take some software and have a GPL license and include an Apache license bit inside there. And that's fine. So it can get complicated, but generally what you would want to do is come up with a list of licenses that you allow or don't allow in your project and stick with that. And follow what people have already done, like, the ASF and other foundations have already done a lot of this work. So, do what most people do when they're writing code, is copy it from somewhere else. So, it's on GitHub with Stack Overflow, so I can just use it. No, sadly. Does anyone here know how code on Stack Overflow is licensed? No? No? Oh, okay. That's pretty cool. It's actually licensed under the Creative Commons license, which is a bit problematic because the Creative Commons license wasn't designed for code. It was designed for other stuff, media, text, images. And it has some restrictions of use in there, which makes it not compatible with the Apache license, for example. So that means you can't take code off Stack Overflow unless you actually reach out to the author and ask permission, and they give you permission to use it, which is sometimes, like if they've written it 10 years ago, you're not able to find them or track them down. And every time you want to do that, that's a whole lot of time and effort that you have to go into and to do, and it just may be too much hassle. GitHub is maybe a little better. In recent years, GitHub has, not mandated, but has encouraged people to put licenses on their code. So if you go to a GitHub repository, you might see, for example, that this project is MIT licensed. And that's a good thing. So that means you can use it. However, we get to the next bit. It says it's MIT licensed, so it must be. Sadly, no. A lot of developers just want to make code, and they will slap a license on it called MIT, and that's fine. It is MIT license, but then they may include other third-party code in that repository, and that third-party code may be under other licenses. In worst case, you'll see something that's MIT licensed, and I've run into this, and then if you look a little closer, it's got things inside of it that are, say, GPL licensed, and it's like, I can't use it. But it wasn't immediately obvious that it was GPL licensed when I first looked at it. So generally, when you're talking about licensing, you'll create a source bundle of all the code that is, and you make that as a release, and it's going to have bits of third-party code in it, and that's all fine. You generally don't have to worry about the dependencies, except when you do. So if you include the dependencies in there, then the licensing matters, but the licensing can also matter in the case of copyleft style licenses. So even just depending on something that has a GPL license may be a legal risk, again, depending on your appetite for risk. And that may mean, in our case at the ASF, it's not compatible with the Apache license. So we can't even have something that depends on a GPL license. The other misconception is, and I've seen this a few times, is that people think if they make enough changes to a piece of code, they can just remove the header and put their own header on it and change the license. And no, sadly, you can't do that. You generally need permission from the owner to be able to change the license. And again, some people are happy to change the license for you. There's been several cases where we've discovered code inside an ASF project that is not appropriately licensed, and we've reached out to the owner and said, would you mind if we use this code? And they've come back and said yes. So, that's great. But you do have to go and ask permission. So one of the things the ASF does is it groups licenses into three categories, and they're called Category A, Category B, and Category X. And this is a good thing to follow. So all the licenses in category A, which are basically the permissive licenses, like MIT, BSD, Apache, and there's a whole bunch of other ones as well. They can be used in a source release, they can be combined together, and you can then bundle the whole thing under the Apache license. So that's great, everything works. Then there's a group of licenses that do place extra restrictions on how you can use them. And they're things like the Eclipse license and the Mozilla license. And there's a few others there too, but they're the two most common ones. So they're sometimes called weak copyleft licenses, because they're not really copyleft licenses, but they have some characteristics that they share. And how the ASF treats those is that we say that they can't be in source code, but it's fine if you make a binary release. You can include them in that. You can distribute that, and that's fine. And then you have things which are actually forbidden, which is category X, and they include things that are incompatible with the Apache license, such as GPL, but they also include other things that are not open source licenses, for example. There's been a proliferation of licenses in recent years that pretend to be open source licenses but aren't. They're not approved by the OSI, and they usually have some restriction on them in terms of, can't be used by cloud providers, or, can only be used by small businesses who have revenue up to $1 million or whatever. Putting a restriction on use on the license means it's not open source. So that's a problem. But if you categorize the licenses like this, you've got a nice, easy reference that someone can go to, and they can look at that, and they can understand pretty easily what licenses they can include and what licenses they can't include, and under what conditions. So, I think this is a good way to go. So there are some common issues, and I think I'm talking a little too fast here. Yeah, I am. There are some common issues in releases that I've seen. The most common one by far is definitely you'll have a license file, and what this license file is supposed to do is it's supposed to list all of the licenses inside your project. So again, at the ASF, obviously it's going to be licensed under the Apache license, but then there might be a whole lot of third-party bits of software in there that are, say, under the MIT license or the BSD license. So it's a good idea to list all those up front in a single file, so anyone who comes to your source code, they can see what all the licenses are. You don't know what policies they might have internally about what licenses they can use or not use. It may be that only some have been approved by their legal team. So having that all listed out there means it's easy to find, and there's no surprises. They don't have to go hunting through the code or whatever. Optionally, an Apache license bit of software also has a notice file, and this notice file includes things such as copyright statements that have been relocated to it, and what's called required third-party notices. And there's almost no required third-party notices. There's a few old licenses that required you to do things that would do this, but it's very uncommon today. So anything that isn't to do with the actual licensing, but is extra information that someone needs to know, will go into that file. And this is generally where things go wrong. There's often missing information in those, or the licensing information is not complete. Sometimes it's even incorrect. I was working on a project about a month ago, and it has a large number of dependencies, about 500. And I was looking through all of these, working out, see what all their licenses were, and make sure we have everything right. And I came across one of them. It says it was MIT licensed, but when I actually downloaded the jars and had a look at the files, it was an MIT license. So sometimes this information is not even correct, which is unfortunate, because now do I take what's in the file? Probably, rather than what's on the website? Yeah, who knows? So that is probably the most common issue. It's issues with the licenses file themselves, and it's incomplete stuff. So the other thing is that a source file or source release should include all the source code that you need to build it from. So sometimes you'll get a release that has some binary bits in it. And that makes it really difficult to work out what the licensing is, because you've got no way of looking at that binary bod to know what's inside it. It could contain anything, and who knows how it's licensed. And this can also be a problem with files that have been compressed or minified or stripped in some way, JavaScript in particular, because the JavaScript files get minified and that strips out a lot of the comments and everything else out of it. And now you suddenly know you're not aware of what is actually in there, and you can sort of read it, but it's horrible. It's not easy to understand. One of the things but when I'm talking about binary files there, I don't mean like a PDF or an image file, whatever. I actually mean compiled code. So if it's got compiled code in it, then it's probably not open source in a true sense, because you can't look at it and see what it was doing. One of the other problems is that you'll get code that gets copied from third parties, and they'll just copy and paste it in there, and they won't mention that it's from there. And I'll talk a little bit later about how you might detect some of that. So sometimes if you're looking through the code, you might just see things that are obvious. It's like this bit of code's written in a totally different style to the rest of the project. Like, that's what's going on there. And then do a bit of searching, and you'll find, oh yeah, that's this bit of code from Joe Blogs, and it's BSD licensed. So that's all fine. For some reason, and I don't know why, but a lot of developers seem to think that test resources are a special case, and that they can just copy anything from the internet and just shove it in there. I've had to vote 4 times, -1 on a release, because it contained a random cat photo from off the internet. Right? Yeah, it was a nice cat photo. I like the cat. It's cute, but don't do that. Like, seriously, it's like, if you want to use an image, take your camera, go outside, take a photo of something, and use that. You own the copyright. You can make it open source. Don't include a professional photographer's cat photo in there. And and it's the same with other test assets as well. So often, some tests require large amounts of text. So someone will just go find large amounts of text and paste it in there. And generally, hopefully they pick something that's out of copyright and is in the public domain, but often that doesn't happen. And even on one occasion, I ran into someone had copied a large portion of the King James Bible in there. And you think, oh, that should be okay. That was written in 1611, I think. You might have to Google search that, but it's around there. So it should have well and truly gone out of copyright. Unfortunately, no. It's actually this weird thing, is that the Crown owns the copyright on that forever. It doesn't actually run out of copyright. So, it's like, it's easily fixed. You replace it with something else. But you can sometimes just get into weird situations and have trouble with things like that. Yeah, the other thing you often see with like test resources, people will copy, Twitter feeds or web pages or, any other random source of data, and they think that that's okay because it's just a test. No, it's not. So the other thing is about dependencies, and I was talking about dependencies before. And you really have to look at all of the dependencies and the transitive dependencies as well, because the further you go down, you might eventually come across something that is, not of the right license. And I ran into this in a project recently. It was using, there should have been a better way to solve this, but for one reason or another, they were including the website in the source release. The website had all the documentation for the software and so forth in there. And it gets compiled as, trying to think what the technology is now. Anyway, some sort of Node JavaScript website thing, packaging. And one of the things it relies on is a database called Can I Use Lite? And Can I Use Lite is basically a browser testing tool. And it is under the Creative Commons license, which is a problem. There's been various talks in that community about changing the license, but they can't change the license because they copied it from someone else who had that original license. So that original project has also talked about possibly changing the license, but decided against it. So now, because it's a browser testing tool, the thing is that it's probably none of the code actually ends up in the source release, because that will be used at compile time to work out what to put in and what not to put in. You know, so there's that sort of library. But because it produces minified JavaScript, actually trying to find out whether it's in there or not in there is almost nigh impossible. And it may be that it's not in there now, but in a month's time, when some new versions come out, bits of it do end up in there. So, you know, you're in this situation where it's really difficult to work out whether it is in there or not in there, which can, you know, really complicate things. The other issue that you can run into is that people will, as I said, take code from third parties, paste it in there, and they'll lose the header information. So you'll lose the licensing, so you won't know what license it's under. And that can cause problems because you've suddenly got this bit of code that's hidden in your code base and it's actually under a different license. This is one of the reasons why the ASF, for example, puts headers on every single file with the license in them. And it's probably a good practice to follow because it means that if someone comes along and takes a single file from your project, if it has the header on it with the license in it, everyone will know where it came from. So that's a good thing to follow. So there's been some changes that have happened in recent years. And it used to be sort of a very informal thing, this license checking, and it's become more and more structured, and foundations and companies have more of a policy around it. There's also been some adaptation of tools, such as SPDX identifiers. Has everyone seen them? They're like a one-line comment that says, this is a known license, and it means that they're easy to search for, to grep, to use CI or whatever. It's very easy for tooling to pick up all the licenses from that way. And then it can actually generate, say, a software bill of materials, which are becoming more common and actually mandated in some cases. So there is also tools like Apache Rat, which will check to see that everything's got a header on it and everything's licensed correctly and so forth. These tools are sometimes create false positives, but they're good things to have. And there are also license scanners like ScanOSS. Really good tool, by the way. It has a huge database of all open source code, and it'll actually tell you if there are snippets of code from somewhere else. So it'll tell you if someone's copied some code from somewhere. It's not perfect. It doesn't always get it right. It sometimes misses things, but it's pretty easy to run, and the results, you can filter through the results quite easily as well to work out where all the bits of code come from. So these are great tools to have to check on your own bit of software. The other thing is that you want to try and catch these issues early. So the better the earlier you introduce the tooling, or the earlier you introduce checks, it means that you're more likely to pick these things up. And I think that's something at the ASF where we could do better, because we often only check for these things when we're making a release, and then we find the issues. And it means that those issues have been there in our GitHub repo for the last 6 months, since the last release or whenever, and it may be that people have copied and downloaded that code, and there's a licensing issue there. So I assume everyone is aware of the CRA. So that has actually come into force. Well, it hasn't come into force yet. It is a thing. It's happened. The full implications of it are not law until December 27, I think it is. Yep. Yeah. So we've got a couple of years on that yet, but they do mean that we have to take this stuff seriously. All right, we just can't ignore it anymore, and that includes open source projects as well. It applies to all software, but open source is affected as well Thankfully, there's some carve-outs in that law for open source software stewards, and that means that they don't have to comply with everything, which would be horrendous. They only have to comply with a shorter list of things. And I actually think this is one reason where foundations are actually going to become more important, because they're going to be seen as like a safe harbour for software to come to. Because they will handle all this compliance for the project, and they won't have to worry so much about it. There is also growing expectations from vendors and governments. Both the US government and the US government in recent time has put in effect a few things that mandate SBOMs for certain industries and things along those lines. So you're going to see more and more of this. So the big issue, though, in the current one is AI-generated code. The problem is, well, the first problem is that there's an unclear legal standing of what if you generate some AI code, is that copyrightable? US currently says no. Most of Europe says no. The UK says, well, maybe. If you put some creative input into it, then actually the person who asked the AI to do that owns the copyright. China has similar things as well. Under some cases, it will be the person who asked the AI to do stuff. So it's not only is it the whole lot of legal things that are going on that make it unclear, it's going to differ from country to country. And if you're an open source project who is generally, open source is global, that makes it very difficult to comply with things like this. The other problem with AI-generated code is that if you can ask it to make up some code, it'll give you some code. It might accidentally give you some code that's been copied line for line from somewhere else, and that may be under a license that's not compatible with your license. So I haven't actually tried this, but I'm sure if you ask ChatGPT to generate a bubble sort in your favourite language, you'll be able to find exactly where that came from, because there will be some variable names or some comments or something in there that'll give it away, and it won't actually have created it in inverted commas itself. It would have just copied it from somewhere. So you've got to be really aware of that. So I think the best practices at the moment, and this is evolving, is that don't blindly trust any AI-generated code that gives you. Treat it like a third-party code. Label it if you can in your code base. So at least at a later date, if something does get decided about the legality of code, then you can AI-generated code, you can come back and sort that all out. It's getting more and more complicated, unfortunately, because modern IDEs these days will actually auto-correct code as they go using AI, and I have no idea what you do about that. It's a problem. So I'm just going to wrap up here. So best practices, start compliance early. Don't do it at release time. Do it before release time. Get a manifest of all your licenses and third-party code that's in there. Start using SBOMs. If you don't know what a software bill of materials is, go and look them up. There are plugins that will generate them for you, so it's not that hard to do. Automate checks where possible. So when you check in your code to GitHub, make sure every file has a header on it. Make sure that possibly contains a SPDX license line, and things like that. Some people want to try and automate all of this, and unfortunately, I don't think that's possible. It will catch 90% of things, and it will point out some obvious errors, but there's always going to be situations where it requires human judgment. So, for example, what I came across recently was I found the GPL license in a source release. Now, what was it doing there? Well, there were three possibilities. It could be there's some GPL code in there. It was just mentioning it for some other reasons, or it could have been maybe an optional dependency or something like that. So there are two of those cases is probably fine. One of the cases is not. And there's no amount of tooling that's going to tell you which one is which, probably. So you've got to be careful with that. The The best thing you can do about it is educate the contributors to your project and tell them, these are the licenses we accept. These are the processes that we need to follow. This is how we document our licenses and where we list them. And also having that in a public space so that anyone who comes along and contributes to your project can understand, what they should do and not do. So there's, a few challenges. So SPDX adoption is still pretty spotty. It's gaining traction, but it's probably something that you should look into. There are definitely gaps among contributors and developers in their knowledge of open source licensing and how to apply it effectively and what they should and shouldn't do. There's certainly some ambiguity around newer licenses, particularly non-OSI ones, and how we can use those and not use those. And the whole AI thing is just, who knows what's going on there. So at some point that's going to be solved in the next decade or so. Fingers crossed. So that's it for me, and I think we have some time for questions.
Yes, thank you very much for that very insightful talk. We do indeed have like 5 minutes for questions, so think about them. But I will start with a question from the remote conference. They're asking, what is your preferred way of automating license compatibility checks and dependencies?
In terms of automation, I don't do a lot of automation. I actually do a lot of manual checks, but I have tools that help me do those manual checks. And my simplest tool that I use is basically a find and grep script that I just say, find general public license, go. So maybe I'm a bit old school, but I actually think that doing things like that by hand, it doesn't take a lot of time and can generally catch things that some automation may not catch.
All right. Are there any questions in the room? Yes. Front here.
So imagine that there is a breach, and a company is suing my company where I work because of wrong licensing. Who is responsible? The company? Is it me if I was the one to make the commit?
You need to speak to a lawyer. It depends on the actual situation. If, say, an employee knowingly copied some code from a third party that wasn't open source, both the company and the employee is probably going to get into trouble. So I think that's what's going to happen. But yeah, no, if you're in a situation like that, you should seek professional legal advice, not talk to me.
All right, let's have another question from the remote conference. Yeah. Is there a reasonable way of using an open source license, such as Apache, but limit some actors from using the software?
No, because it's no longer an open source license there. And this has been discussed at the ASF. And there are a couple of licenses out there that say revert to Apache after a couple of years. We've told them to stop doing that.
All right. There was a question in front here.
Thank you. I was a bit surprised that when you are using some dependencies and those projects have some dependencies, but they have licensed something. I mean, why we cannot trust that license? And if their licensing is wrong, if that should be their problem, why we will be accused? Or
well, it's both your problems. The project that got the license wrong, they should hopefully fix it. And that's what I've done in a few cases. I've reached out to the project and say, oh, by the way, your license says it's this here and it says it's this here. Can you just fix that up, please? And, generally they're quite responsive to that.
If the legal problem happened, will we be the responsible or those?
Well, it depends what you mean by a legal problem. I mean, it's a licensing issue. Exactly. It's not necessarily a legal problem until someone takes you to court, but,
I'd like to remind everyone, always use the microphone so that the remote conference can already also hear the questions.
Thank you for your insightful talk. Apologies, I came halfway through, so you may have already covered this, but licenses that change midway through a project, what are some top tips around it? I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
It's open-ish, but you're going for a more open license or going the other direction. Just quick, 1 or 2 tips around that.
Yeah.
Because that's the one that gets me all the time.
Try and choose projects, if possible, and this is not always possible, that are not backed by a single corporate entity. because a single entity that has control of a project is likely to change the license at some point. If you use software from foundations, such as the Apache Software Foundation, the license is never going to change. So that is one way of mitigating that risk, but of course you don't always have that choice. Generally what will happen if in this case where, say it's an open source license and it's no longer an open source license, the project will be forked. And so you go on, keep using the fork, and that would be my advice.
Yeah, just thank you very much. I wish I had seen this last year. We've gone through a phase of trying to structure things internally where I am. So I have two questions. First one is, where do you get such a fabulous shirt? And the second, more important question is, when we try to socialize this as an issue within the organization and trying to get the legal teams and central IT teams to kind of really just recognize that we need their input, we need their capabilities. Have you any tips on how to do that within a kind of commercial setting, so that the legal department aren't just looking at tenders and things, but actually taking this seriously if we are to open source software? So
generally the legal team inside a company may not have experience with this. This is mostly around copyright law, and their expertise may be somewhere else. So they may not be the best people to they can help out, but they probably can't actually give professional advice because that's not their area of expertise. I would probably, in that case, try and come up with something myself based on best practice from other foundations, and then show it to the lawyers and say, what do you think of this? And see what they think. That may be the best approach. And I'll tell you where I got the shirt later. Yeah.
This is actually more of a comment and less of a question, just to the question that this gentleman asked. So I used to work for the Linux Foundation for a bit. I would strongly advise you that when you're choosing open source projects, either choose open source projects that are being sourced in companies that have strong relationships with either the Linux Foundation or the Apache Software Foundation or the Eclipse Foundation. Those are the three most kind of reputable places where things get open sourced. They don't necessarily need to donate the projects to those organizations, but the fact that they have that relationship is going to show you that the company is very serious about maintaining open source projects as open source. Obviously, if you can use a project that is like housed within one of those open source organizations, the entire reason that they exist is to protect the legality and the licensing of those projects, and that is like hugely important. Yeah. And we tend to forget it now, but like a lot of the older open source projects like Linux, like Postgres, the ones that have been around for like 20 or 30 years, like this was a hard fought battle. And, you know, if you're sort of within a company, you're trying to advocate for open source, I think the other thing that you can do is advocate sending people to contribute upstream to these projects to maintain their sort of multi-company stakeholders. Because that really, if you want to talk about this, I have a talk on Postgres tomorrow where we talk about this a little bit. That is really important to a project's longevity, is the diversity of the community. Dr. Dawn Foster gives a lot of great talks around this. Usually not at this conference. She typically talks at FOSS Backstage, but you should also look up her talks as well.
Thank you.
All right, that concludes our Q&A session. After a wonderful talk, please give it up again for Justin.